David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So this past Friday, just about every single corporate media outlet uncritically repeated obviously false unemployment headlines, which Donald Trump then used to claim everything's going great in the economy, despite us still being in the middle of the largest jobs downturn in a very, very long time, with historically high unemployment rates. Now, the crazy thing about this is, I told you guys this was going to happen just 2 weeks ago. If you listen to this podcast, if you watch the YouTube clip, I did a story called "You're About to Get Slammed with Garbage Math." And in that story, I specifically said, when the economy starts to recover, you are going to get hit with growth rates that will be based on the absolute bottom of this disaster. So I gave the example. Air travel dropped 96%. And then you saw a headline, air travel up 120%. Well, okay, from the decreased by 96% number, it has doubled. And I told you it would happen with GDP. I told you it would happen with jobs numbers. And it took only 2 weeks, and we're now seeing it. But it's actually even worse because it's based on admittedly incorrect numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Not only are they lying in exactly the way that I predicted they would be lying, they aren't even reporting what's actually in the BLS jobs report. And this is so important that everybody understand. So all day Friday, Trump and corporate media were reporting unemployment rate way down to 13.3%, 2.5 million jobs created. The report says in it that because of what's called a misclassification error, the unemployment rate has been reported 3 months in a row as being lower than it actually is and was. This was reported by almost no corporate media, and we're going to show you the actual numbers and one report from corporate media that actually looked to get it right, but it was sort of like swept under the rug. So for context, remember, I want a recovery. I want coronavirus to end. I want the economy to recover. I never wanted anybody to die from coronavirus. I don't want a crappy economy or death in order to hurt Donald Trump and his reelection chances. That's an allegation that people like Donald Trump Jr. have made. It's ridiculous, okay? But we have to tell the truth, and the truth is not being told. So let's get right into the numbers. Back in April, the unemployment rate of 15% was reported, 14.7%. Due to what's called a classification error, the real rate was 19%. Now, for May, we just got the May numbers, they are saying the unemployment rate is 13.3%, while the actual rate is really 16.3%. Now, to be totally clear and honest, this is still an improvement from April to May. And this is still the worst unemployment we've ever had, dating back to 1948 when the numbers started being tracked the way that they are today. So what the hell happened here? What happened is that employees who should be considered temporarily unemployed, which does count towards the unemployment rate, were instead classified as absent from work for other reasons. Temporarily unemployed counts towards the unemployment rate that we know as the U3. That's the rate that we're talking about here. If you're absent from work for other reasons, it does not count towards the unemployment rate. Now, usually absent for other reasons would be something like you're on a vacation or you're on extended jury duty, you're taking care of a child or relative. That's very different than your business is closed and you are unemployed, even if the idea is you're going to go back to work when that business reopens. For some reason, and we really don't know what, I'm not implying that Trump tinkered with the data. There are very conspiratorial claims about Trump forced the hand of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That it's a huge organization, and absent evidence of that, I think it would be irresponsible to suggest Trump demanded fake numbers be published, because they did publish the real numbers. They were just in a footnote. For some reason, people who should have been counted in the unemployment rate in April and May were counted as this other category, which artificially lowers the unemployment rate. The report says this happened due to coronavirus-related business closures as unemployed on temporary layoffs. However, it is apparent that not all such workers were so classified. They claim to be investigating why the misclassification error continues to occur. So this has now happened 3 times. In March, the real unemployment rate was 5.4. They reported 4.4. In April, the real unemployment rate was 19.7. They reported 14.7. And in May, the new numbers, the real unemployment rate is 16.3. They reported 13.3. So understand that from this same error, we now have 3 months of headlines that are wrong, almost exclusively reported in the incorrect form by corporate media. I found one instance of this being mentioned on Friday. Here's Steve Ratner on MSNBC, who actually said, hey, you know what? There's different numbers there that are the actual numbers. Take a look.
Through this, what I think those of us who are into these weeds are finding is there is a note in the BLS report today that has to do with methodology specifically relating to the COVID problem, and I won't get into all the weeds on that. But BLS is noting that issue has a 3 percentage point impact on unemployment, and so that a number of economists are thinking that the right number to be looking at is more like 16% or 16.3%, i.e.
Now, again, understand, I am not blaming Trump. It is true that a bunch of jobs were created in May, or at least rehabilitated jobs. That's a good thing. But the unemployment rate is still a record high of more than 16.3%. The Trump administration has been going crazy with the economists were wrong. Well, unemployment was expected to hit 20% at its peak, and it hit 19.7 in April. They just didn't report that number except in a little footnote. They reported it as 14.7. So the bragging about we know what's actually going on, the economists don't know, they predicted 20, they were way off. It's all been predicted accurately. And I'm the first to tell you that economists are notably bad at making economic predictions. But none of this matters. The Trump administration has not only been touting these incorrect numbers for 4 days now, they've already created campaign ads around these incorrectly reported numbers. The jobs report says unemployment is 16.3%. We've never had anything this high short of last month. And they are claiming victory and saying, let's reelect Trump based on these record disaster unemployment numbers. They're living in a fantasy world, and I fear that it is going to work, and we're going to talk about this a little more later on in the program. Okay, we have some friends on the right and some friends on the left that are really missing the mark on a story about Mitt Romney and Colin Powell and potentially George W. Bush not supporting Trump in the upcoming election. So here's what's going on. In the last 24 hours, there have been reports and interviews that former Republican President George W. Bush, current Republican Senator Mitt Romney, lifelong Republican Colin Powell, and some others will not be supporting the reelection of Donald Trump. Now, it's important to understand that that doesn't mean they're necessarily voting for Joe Biden. We'll get to that in a second. The reactions from the right have been completely predictable. These are loser-triggered Republicans who are either jealous of Trump's success or mad that Trump doesn't listen to them, or they have personal grudges. Don Jr. tweeted, who cares? He actually said, who gives a you-know-what, that I think it's Colin Powell or Mitt Romney isn't going to be supporting Trump. Sort of like, these are losers. We don't care about them. They're not even really Republicans as far as we're concerned. Predictable response from the right. I don't care. But sadly, I'm seeing some really bad takes on this from some people on the left, and they're mostly coming from the slice of the left that is virulently, irrationally anti-Joe Biden. I've started hearing from people on the left stuff like, David, the reason Romney and Colin Powell and maybe Bush aren't supporting Trump is because Biden is so far right that they are just more aligned with Biden's politics. They're Republicans and Biden's basically a Republican. That's why they are doing this, and everybody should be criticized for it. That is absolute idiocy. And it's time for people to pull up their big boy pants and understand what's actually going on here. Come on with me. Let's take a journey. So first and foremost, what actually happened over the last 24, 48 hours? A couple different things. Number one, the New York Times reports that former Republican President George W. Bush is not going to support the re-election of Trump. This doesn't mean that he's going to vote for Joe Biden. And in his defense, a spokesman for Bush is saying the report is wrong. George W. Bush is steering clear of politics, which, quite frankly, is a coy way of saying he's not supporting Trump. He may just not be getting involved whatsoever, but that is where the George W. Bush situation stands as of right now. Not really a denial that George W. Bush doesn't support Trump, but simply just saying he's not getting involved in politics right now. Bush's brother, Jeb Bush, the former Republican governor of Florida, he says he's not sure who he's going to vote for. Mitt Romney, current Republican senator from Utah, will not endorse Trump and was, by the way, Mitt Romney yesterday out with protesters in Washington, D.C. saying Black Lives Matter. Neither will late Senator John McCain's wife, Cindy McCain. She will not be supporting Donald Trump. And here's Colin Powell yesterday on CNN, straight up telling Jake Tapper he's voting for Joe Biden.
And so we're not a country of just a president. We have a Congress. We have a Supreme Court. But most of all, we have the people of the United States, the ones who vote him in and the ones who vote him out. I couldn't vote for him in '96, and I certainly cannot in any way support President Trump this year.
So, I know you didn't vote for him in 2016. I assume, based on the fact that you approved Joe Biden when then Senator Obama picked him to be his running mate in 2008, I assume you're going to be voting for Joe Biden?
I'm very close to Joe Biden on a social matter and on a political matter. I've worked with him for 35, 40 years, and he is now the candidate, and I will be voting for him.
So the reactions from some who have been writing to me have been war criminal Colin Powell is voting for Biden. Two war criminals, no surprise. Or Republicans are voting for Biden because Biden's basically a Republican. This is an indictment of Joe Biden. Now, you can dislike Joe Biden. You can choose not to vote for Joe Biden. But the bad takes about this are really painful. Like, it's cringeworthy to watch. You've got people on the left in the face of Republicans abandoning their own party for what they see as the good of the country. And the people on the left that are writing to me are criticizing these Republicans and criticizing Joe Biden. Come on, guys. You're looking foolish. For years, we've been saying, wouldn't it be great if some Republicans did what's right for the country instead of just checking the party orthodoxy? And that's exactly what they are doing here. The better analysis is they are so disgusted by what Donald Trump is doing that lifelong Republicans are saying, I can't stand with my party. I can't actually just go with the party orthodoxy. I'm going to have to support someone else who I would normally never support, never mind publicly admitting it. And, reminder, Bush spokesman is denying this anyway. We don't know what's going on with George Bush, but it doesn't matter, certainly as far as Colin Powell goes and Mitt Romney. This should be viewed as a good thing. A Democratic candidate in the face of absolute totalitarian Donald Trump is a reasonable enough diplomat that lifelong Republicans are okay saying, this time around, I can't just check the box that my party wants me to check. I'm not with the lunatics like Ted Cruz. I'm not with, Tom Cotton and these whack jobs. I am going to think for myself and do what I see as good for the country. It should be applauded that they're doing this. Now, it's also a really bad example of post facto rationalization by some on the left who are now coming up with these criticisms. If Bernie convinced some Republicans to vote for him, it would be rightly cheered. If Biden does it, it's because Biden is a Republican. Come on, guys, give me a break. These guys are conservatives. They're not fascists. So they aren't going to support a president taking the country down a very dark path. And that's supposed to be an indictment of Biden? Now, of course, at the same time, it's still true that Biden is no progressive. Biden is a totally standard center-left Democrat. He wants a $15 minimum wage. His health care proposal would give about 30 million people additionally health care. Trump's would take it away from about 24 to 32 million. Biden supports the Green New Deal as a framework. His tax program is better than Trump's, et cetera. Okay, he's a center-left Republican. Now, meanwhile, Democrats don't need to celebrate these endorsements if they don't want to, right? Let some right-wingers see that Mitt Romney is saying no to Trump, see that Colin Powell is saying no to Trump. Let them evaluate what that means for how they're going to vote. And meanwhile, Joe Biden can just keep running his campaign. We're not whitewashing the records of these Republicans. These Republicans can be horrible people who govern terribly and are just making one correct decision here, right? That's all it has to be. And quite frankly, the second that a Democrat is elected to president, these guys likely won't be our allies anymore. We simply agree that Trump is such a systemic danger that must be removed that they can't vote for him just because there's an R next to his name. And that should be applauded. That should be applauded. Meanwhile, we'll go right back to arguing about taxes and foreign policy and the entire thing as soon as Donald Trump is removed and a Democratic president takes over. We are fighting a proto-fascist here. Don't miss the forest for the trees. I'm ready for your disagreements. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. I look forward to hearing from you. Remember to sign up for free to get the daily David Pakman Show audio podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Pandora, Google Play Podcasts, whatever your favorite podcasting software is. Get the daily audio podcast if you prefer that to YouTube clips, as an example. Let me know your thoughts about these Republican abandonments of Trump on Twitter, where you can find me at dpacman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
All right, today's new members of the day are Dimitrios Niapas and John Hall. Also, a big thank you to Susan Bruce. Susan is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Susan's been a member almost 5 years, dating all the way back to 2015. Thank you all so much for your support. Grab a membership as well as all of the great perks that come with it at joinpakman.com. It won't hurt a bit, and it takes under a minute to sign up, and it really does support the work that we're doing. Okay, we have to talk about the rapidly spreading meme or demand or talking point, this idea of abolish the police. And this has basically three forms. Sometimes it's literally abolish the police. Sometimes it's defund the police. And sometimes it's simply called ACAB, all cops are bastards. Some version of this is essentially what we're talking about here. Now, I believe that this catch-all is completely miscalculated. I believe it's inaccurate, and I believe it dramatically helps Donald Trump get reelected if it were to become a prominent theme of Democrats, and I can't believe Joe Biden would do it, but if Joe Biden were to adopt this in the time remaining between now and the election, I'll tell you why, and then we can talk about it. We have a problem with police brutality in the United States. We have a problem with lack of proper training for police. We have a problem with militarized police departments in this country. We have a problem with lack of police accountability in the United States. We are seeing overwhelmingly peaceful protests demanding that these issues be dealt with, and that's a beautiful thing. They were catalyzed by the horrific killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And protests like this and rallies like these have not been seen in the United States for a long time, and it is a great thing. But abolish the police, defund the police. Sometimes the messaging can seem inspirational or catchy, but it doesn't actually make any sense, and it's not popular, and it is a huge risk if the left is going to adopt this as part of a platform heading into November. Abolish or defund the police is using a sledgehammer when what you need is a velvet glove, and I'll explain why, and I'll defend my position on this, and then if you disagree, I want to hear from you. The problem is just not as simple as police have too much money, and if we take the money away, we solve the problem. The problem is not as simple as police need to be eliminated and then we would be much better off, including replacing police altogether with social service agencies or community watch groups or whatever the case may be. The problem is sometimes too much police funding for the wrong things. The problem is sometimes lack of training. The problem is not enough funding in some cases. And that can actually be the cause of the problems we're trying to solve. So let's just get really specific about it. Let's start with one example. Many police departments have become militarized like armies. This is something I talked about last week. And I mentioned last week, and this is super important, police training in the United States is too short and doesn't deal with how police officers should actually be trained to be better stewards of their communities and to de-escalate situations rather than escalate situations. In many countries, police training is much longer than in the United States. That costs more money, but that extra training should not be focused on riot control with rubber bullets. It should instead be social work type training. If police were trained more like social workers and less like soldiers, if police were equipped with de-escalation tools rather than military vehicles, then we would eliminate many of the disastrous outcomes that we have, because the first instinct of more police would be to de-escalate rather than to say, is this a time to pull a gun or to use a taser or to pull out a nightstick or baton or shield or police a military vehicle. But the reality is that could cost more money. It could cost more money to better train police for longer. If you double the amount of time police officers spend in training from 13 to 26 weeks, it's likely that is going to cost more money, not less. And so the sledgehammer of abolish the police or defund the police fails to actually achieve what we want. I mentioned militarization. When a police department is militarized, they see themselves more like a military force than as members of the community. And they solve problems with the tools that they have. Again, shields, military type vehicles, riot control tactics, pepper spray balls, and the like. In this case, we need to demilitarize the police. Now, you might do that by strategically cutting funding for certain types of training and equipment in order to achieve the demilitarization of police. Beautiful, brilliant, I'm all for it. But again, defund the police or abolish the police does not actually leave us better off. Now, in some police departments, the problem is they don't have enough funding. They can't hire enough officers. They can't do community activism and involvement. So when a police department is underfunded, they resort to the cheap policing of what we call low-hanging fruit. If you are underfunded and police aren't properly trained and you don't have the resources you need to get police involved in the community, you basically just send tons of cops to poor areas. You send the cops you have to poor areas. And as we know, those areas are disproportionately non-white, and they hang out there. Maybe they do stop and frisk or similar type tactics. And then they just rack up arrests simply by saying, you know, we send people to the areas where we believe there is the most crime. And of course, because that's the only area they are in, they find crime there and nowhere else, and it gets up their arrest numbers, and it's the self-fulfilling prophecy that we know so well. So that's an example where the police department might actually be better if they were better funded, not to get shoulder-mounted RPGs and riot gear, but to actually have proper levels of staffing, to be involved in the community, to be trained in de-escalation like social workers. Let me give you one more example of this. A lot of police are policing places where they don't live. And in fact, sometimes there's a big divide where you have officers who live in rural areas outside of a city policing an urban area. And this is not a good thing for a number of different reasons. When you have community members policing their communities, you typically are going to be much better off because you don't have outsiders coming in. The people in the community are going to be better disposed to the police because it's not these outsiders from some other place who just come in and do whatever and then they leave and they sleep somewhere else at night. And you are going to have police officers that are more actually taking a stake in the long-term effects of their policing rather than just doing the easy stuff, the low-hanging fruit, as I mentioned. But in big cities, you might need more funding in order to do that. The reason a lot of police don't live where they are working is it's too expensive. So this is not me saying give everybody raises, umbrella. But the point is, in order to achieve something that would improve a lot of police departments, requires some percentage of the force to live in the area that they police, it might not be cheaper. You may not be able to do that simply by defunding. So I am as disgusted and enraged as you are by the horrifying videos of sick police brutality from the last 10 days of protests. My question is defunding or abolishing police really going to solve the problem? Now, a couple other things that I want to mention. We should have a central database of bad police actors so that when there are complaints and when there are dismissals, it's harder for an officer to hide that when they go and apply somewhere else. And it's harder for the new to police department to say, we had no idea. You have a central database of bad police actors. The unions will likely oppose this. It would be a fight, but it would cost money to maintain such a database. Civilian review boards for police use of force complaints and police shootings. Some cities have done this. That can cost money. Mandatory police body cameras. That can cost money. Now, hopefully, you'd be able to reallocate funding away from militarization and towards cameras, et cetera. But again, the catch-all of abolish or defund does not take into account any of these details. One last thing here. As progressives, we should be for government and state involvement where it makes sense. We want the government involved in healthcare, for example. They're not enough involved right now. We want the government involved in regulating industry. They do not regulate themselves effectively. When it comes to law enforcement, we actually want government doing it and not the people, because the people sounds nice when you imagine neighborhood watches and how that will work. But you have two problems. First, the people in your neighborhood quickly become some private security firm with the best lobbyists and can get the most weapons. Google cops you get free with ads. But to get better service, get Amazon Prime Police. And by the way, it comes with being able to watch some TV shows for free as well. We don't want that. It will become the police equivalent of private prisons or private mercenary firms that fight wars overseas for us. It's not the progressive option. Secondly, there is no denying that sometimes you actually need the scope of state and government. Missile defense as a private endeavor where neighborhoods decide, here's how we're going to defend ourselves from missile attacks, doesn't really work well. And in the case of policing, you need these state and federal law enforcement resources to deal with things that are big, like human trafficking. It's too big and too complex for communities and private industry to deal with human trafficking and the global, federal, state, and local elements that need to be combined. So the solution that is progressive is not defund or abolish the police. It's elect the right people to fix the police, ensure that the police are working for us in the way that we want. And you do that in part by electing the right people to make those decisions. Change the mayor, change the governor, change the police chief. Now, one more thing. Should other areas have more funding? Yes. Do we need more funding for teachers and education? Of course. Do we need more funding for public health and public housing and homelessness? And of course we do. That is a separate issue from defund or abolish the police. Absolute last thing on this. Defund the police is being hugely boosted by bots online because they know it's divisive. And I hate to tell you that it'll help Trump. Defunding the police as of 2 days ago has 16% support in this country. It's very low. There is more support than ever for reforming the police. We previously discussed, did it make sense in 2018 for Democrats to run on abolish ICE, even if you support it? I don't believe that that would have been logical in 2018. I see no evidence that abolish the police is a good platform, and I believe that it will help Donald Trump to get reelected. If Joe Biden were to adopt it, it would dramatically hurt his chances of winning in November, if this is still a very prominent issue at that point. Tell me where you agree or disagree. Okay, let's now dig further into the idea of what government should and shouldn't be involved in, which is a really major part of the conversation about police departments. We've already talked about calls to abolish or defund the police in light of the protests and the killing of George Floyd. There's a bigger question implicit in that discussion, which is, What should governments be involved in and what shouldn't governments be involved in? And this is a question that really tracks political views, because on one side you have extreme small government conservatives and libertarians. They will sometimes go as far as to say roads should be privatized. You can pay the owner to use whichever road you want or look for a different road. Another example would be the privatization of law enforcement, where if you want to be able to call the police, you pay some kind of a membership fee to the law enforcement company that you prefer, Google Cops or Amazon Police or whatever. These are extreme examples, but there are some small government libertarians that believe this stuff. On the extreme other hand, you have truly communist governments, where the government would potentially own all of the industry and be the sole employer. They manufacture the vehicles. The government employs the doctors, owns the hospitals, owns every restaurant, decides what food rations people get and what farmers need to do with the crops that they grow. These are two extremes. We have no examples of success in the modern world for either of the two extremes, because like with most things, the devil is in the details. This is gray area. So let's dig into it. My starting point as a social democrat is that there are many things government should be doing instead of private industry, but we should be able to articulate a compelling reason for why the government should be involved instead of private industry. So in other words, government should not be the only provider of a good or service unless there is a specific case about why they should be. One of the most important things that governments should be doing in industries where they are not participating is setting the ground rules, which I call regulation. I don't need government providing, for example, car insurance, but I do want government saying to private businesses, if you want to be in the market of offering car insurance, here are the rules you have to abide by. Similarly, I don't want the government running airlines and making the airplanes, but I do want government heavily involved in saying, if you're going to build airplanes, here are the ground rules. If you are going to sell tickets to fly people around, here are the ground rules you need to adhere to. Now, most examples are pretty easy to get agreement on. For example, very few people believe the government should be the sole manufacturer of mobile phones. And we've got plenty of companies, Samsung, Apple, and others that are innovating in that space and making mobile phones, and that's fine. But we'll get back to mobile phones because there are complexities that come in when you introduce externalities which justify the role of government. Now, on the other hand, most people do believe that government should be responsible for police departments and law enforcement, missile defense, defending the country from foreign attackers, stopping terrorism, etc. And as I mentioned in the other segment, you might think that it's a good idea to leave something like human trafficking to nonprofits and community groups, but this is stuff with such a massive legal infrastructure and it's so big and wide-ranging. I do want a properly functioning government law enforcement apparatus to be dealing with something like human trafficking correctly. So the small government versus big government ideas are very often theoretical. They're about principles, but you've got to do way more work to really figure out how our economy should be organized. Healthcare is something. I want government more involved in healthcare. There are examples from all over the world of government being involved in healthcare and the healthcare being better. Healthcare is an exception, as I mentioned. We need a compelling reason to say this should be pulled out of for-profit markets. When we're talking about people's health, I don't believe at a moral level that that should be something subject to the whims of companies looking to make profits. So as a social democrat, I would say healthcare meets the requirement to be pulled out of for-profit market-based. And then you've got gray area. So like, I don't need the government running all the hospitals or employing all the doctors necessarily, but maybe I just want them being the insurance company, negotiating prices, establishing ground rules. Okay, that's something that I would want. Let me give you another gray area. I want the government doing lots of infrastructure spending. I want them improving our airports and our roads and our bridges. I don't need the government running the construction companies or being the construction company and buying the bulldozers and the skid steers and doing it all themselves. I'm fine with government hiring private industry to do the actual infrastructure work. The problem is when the process of hiring private industry becomes a crony capitalist snow job where the jobs are given to the president's friends. So I'm a social democrat. I do think that markets, when they actually are well regulated and function fairly, direct resources where they are most useful from a utility point of view. And sometimes we have to say this area of society should not be subjected to the market calculation of where the most utility is derived, health being one of those examples. I don't believe for a second this BS that we hear about. Industries have incentives to regulate themselves. Government doesn't need to regulate because if the business does something bad, the PR will be terrible. News reports about them will make them lose money. Just doesn't work. Doesn't work. Consider a company that makes cars and they pollute and harm some town that's downwind and people in that town get way more lung cancer over the 20 years after the cars have been manufactured. That's an externality. Now you could say, well, the bad PR of people hearing about that is going to make fewer people buy that company's cars. And so the company has an incentive not to pollute in order to keep selling more cars and avoid the bad PR. Just doesn't happen. These externalities are only often loosely assignable to a specific action by a company. Oftentimes, even if the company gets sued, it is cheaper to pollute and kill a bunch of people. And every once in a while, you just pay some civil lawsuit. So the point here is the externalities are not properly dealt with by markets, and that is the role of government regulation. So the takeaway is, I want most areas of life operating in well-regulated markets with the profits properly taxed to ensure that everyone has a decent standard of living. I want industry to operate in a market with enough safeguards and infrastructure, and it is not to their advantage to hurt people in order to earn the profits that they are earning. That's why the regulation has to be strict enough. And in some cases, I actually want the government participating in the market rather than just regulating it. Healthcare being an exception, an example of that. So this stuff is complex. The principles people who talk about liberty and non-aggression, and they just want to talk abstractly, they often don't want to do or aren't able to do the difficult work of really digging into the specifics, and you have to do it in order to really get anywhere on this stuff. We're going to continue talking about this on the David Pakman Show Instagram page at David Pakman Show. Make sure you're following us there.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
So Donald Trump just got his worst polling during this campaign so far, down to Joe Biden by 14 points nationally. And these are just unconscionable numbers. And a report from Axios about what's going on inside the Trump White House and inside the Trump campaign shows panic, fear, anger at what's going on. So this latest poll from CNN is rated as a B+ pollster by 538. Their polling is pretty good. They have Trump's approval down to 38%. That rivals the lows of Trump's presidency. And then in terms of Biden versus Trump for November, this poll has Biden at 55, Trump at 41. Now, what's important about this poll, other than Biden's absolutely ridiculous 14-point lead, is that Biden is well above 50%. If you look back to June of 2016, in other words, this time in the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton was very rarely hitting 50%. You can go back and you can find a poll here or there where Hillary had 50, maybe 51. But in June of 2016, Hillary Clinton was mostly polling in the low 40s and occasionally in the high 40s with the occasional 50 or 51. Joe Biden is now regularly polling at 50% or more in recent polls. And that is a very different starting point than where Hillary Clinton was back in June of 2016. Now, the difference is Biden's running against an incumbent, whereas Hillary Clinton running against Trump was two challengers or two potential candidates. And there is some degree to which one might expect as we get closer to the election, people will break for the incumbent, and that would certainly benefit Donald Trump. So publicly, Trump is insisting that he's doing really well. He very often will tweet versions of what he tweeted this morning saying, quote, 96% approval rating in the Republican Party. Thank you. The source is never cited. The source is never clear. But Trump posts that all the time. And publicly, he's pretending that he's doing really well and that Joe Biden can't win unless, Democrats cheat in the fall or something like that, which is hilarious, by the way. Privately, Donald Trump's aides and advisors are coming to him and telling him, these polls don't look good and you need to do something. They know how bad the polls are. A source briefed on internal polls is calling them, quote, brutal, and seeing a major drop off in independent support. While Trump's Republican support is remaining relatively high, his Democratic support is extremely low. Independents have been shifting away from Trump significantly in the last few months. When the looting starts, the shooting starts thing that Trump said is troubling for some of Donald Trump's top aides. And clearly they know that Trump's disgustingly divisive reaction to the protests have hurt him. And they are saying Trump needs to instead give a message of hope, optimism, and unification. And from that recommendation came this idea that's now being floated about maybe Trump could give a, quote, major speech on race. Now, I have to tell you, as hilarious as a major speech on race would be from Donald Trump, I don't even know that I would cover it. Normally, I would, stream major presidential speeches, but I don't know that I would cover that. It would be merely a propaganda piece. Trump probably would barely even understand what he was reading off of his prompter. It would be calculated to try to get a few more points in a poll, and I don't even know that I would cover that speech. Now, a few insights into a Zoom call that took place with Trump's top campaign advisors. Corey Lewandowski asked the question, what is our message? Which is a relevant question. It's not clear what Trump's message is right now. They seem to settle on the idea of something like a great American comeback theme, the idea of using those misreported jobs numbers from last week to build this optimistic comeback strategy for the next 5 months. That's going to be tough because Donald Trump, on one hand, is appealing to his hardcore base with his wild and hateful and divisive rhetoric, talking about sending in the military ominous weapons. That doesn't play well with a lot of people. But if Trump switches to a unification message to try to get his polling up, it's not clear that that's going to play well with his hardcore supporters. What would be nice would be for Trump to say, hey, you know what, guys? We failed. We failed. The country has lost confidence in me, if they ever had it. We are all going to be resigning. We failed. We are failures, and I'm sorry. That's what should happen. It will never happen. They are going to have to be removed. When you get a tick and it attaches to your body and you try to just pull it off, you can't. The tick hangs on for dear life. They are going to have to be removed like a deer tick. You're going to have to pour alcohol on it, take tweezers, squeeze it by the head and try to get it to release its grip on your skin. That's the analogy of how they're going to have to be removed. These are some of Trump's worst numbers ever. But at the same time, 38% of the country thinks he's doing a good job. That is horrifying, and it means he can win in November. And I don't know if the 38% are people who are cult-like in their following of Trump, or what he does doesn't matter, or they're not paying attention, or they don't care, or they're cognitively impaired. I don't know what it is, but he still has 38% support. He can still win, and we need to get out there and make sure that we prevent a re-election in November. Donald Trump's Attorney General, William Barr, is now claiming that the pepper spray used to clear the path from the White House to St. John's Church is, quote, not a chemical irritant. This is the latest version, the latest defense of the now 7-day-old photo op that Donald Trump did, which ended, remember, with Donald Trump awkwardly holding a Bible in front of St. John's Church last Monday. We had video for you from last week of protesters clearly being gassed and dispersed with horses. You can see the gas rising as protesters flee. So the first statement the White House put out was no tear gas was used. Seemed like an obvious lie, and indeed, eventually a statement was put out, I believe, by the Park Service saying, we were wrong when we said it was incorrect to say that tear gas was not used. That was not true. So then William Barr, who's a completely sinister character in this entire Greek tragedy of the Trump administration, Trump's attorney general, defended the use of what they used by saying, listen, they were warned multiple times before we started deploying the crowd control elements like gas. And we'll pick it up there. Here's William Barr saying, once police met resistance from protesters, yes, it was appropriate to use tear gas to clear a path for Donald Trump. Take a look.
Were appropriate. Is that what you're saying? When they met resistance, yes. They announced 3 times. They didn't move. By the way, there was no tear gas used. The tear gas was used Sunday when they had to clear 8th Street to allow the fire department to come in to save St. John's Church. That's when tear gas was used.
There were chemical irritants.
No, there were not chemical irritants. Pepper spray is not a chemical irritant. It's not chemical.
Pepper spray, you're saying, is what was used.
Pepper balls.
Right. And you believe that was appropriate.
So Barr says everything was justified, tear gas was not used, and pepper spray balls are not a chemical irritant. So let's go through these claims one by one. First, tear gas wasn't used. Local reporters went through the area after this fiasco, and they collected used canisters of CM Speed Heat CS and CM Scat Shell OC. These are 2 types of tear gas. Now, is it possible that that was tear gas left over from the previous day, as William Barr is claiming, that the previous day, Sunday, not Monday, they used tear gas? I guess it's hypothetically possible. Doesn't seem hugely likely. So that part, Barr saying tear gas wasn't used, appears to be a lie. Then we get into the semantic thing, tear gas versus pepper spray. They are both chemical irritants. Each uses a different irritant. Pepper spray uses capsicum, which comes from the active compound in hot peppers. Tear gas is a halogen compound that is powder-like at room temperature. So in the most technical sense, these are 2 different things, but the CDC classifies pepper spray as a form of tear gas, so it becomes merely a semantic argument. Now, lastly, Barr says pepper spray is not a chemical irritant. Well, it is an irritant. This issue of chemical is that the chemical is one that exists in food as well. It's a highly concentrated version of the irritant in peppers. So what Barr maybe is leaning on is that it's a natural element rather than a lab-made chemical. But when you're talking about hot peppers and going through a process where you extract the irritant from the peppers, concentrate it into a pepper spray, the fact that it's, quote, naturally occurring seems irrelevant. And William Barr, he seems to be suggesting that this is no different than tossing some jalapenos at protesters. This is a highly concentrated, very powerful irritant that, once again, the CDC classifies as a form of tear gas. So it's gaslighting and it's deception all around. And William Barr, a horribly sinister figure in the Trump administration once again.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We are in the middle of a global 100-year pandemic, the highest unemployment since 1948, which is the first year that unemployment was tracked under the modern system. The largest nationwide protests that we've seen in a very long time, these over police brutality, and one of the highest numbers of horrifying police brutality incidents that this country has seen in such a short period of time in decades. And Donald Trump set a new record for himself, sending out 200 tweets and retweets in a single day on Friday. The president cannot lead, and instead he's tweeting from behind his bunker. Factbase, which track this, tweeted, "We're wrapping the day at 200 tweets for Donald Trump, most for the account ever, period. At 468 tweets, it's the most in a week for Trump during his presidency, and 74 tweets between 8 and 9 a.m., the most in an hour ever." As you can see there, if you're looking at the chart along with me, June 5th, surpassing January 22nd with 200 total tweets and retweets, the most of any day during Donald Trump's presidency. Donald Trump is now tweeting, by the way, from behind 2 miles of fencing and barricades, much of it installed over the last week as Bunker Boy, as many are calling him, further isolates himself from reality. So there are about 5 or 6 different relevant layers here. First of all, I'm not president of the United States. I just have this show. I don't have time to tweet nearly 200 times in a day. On a day where I tweet a lot, where I feel like I probably tweeted too much today, I might tweet 15 times. Maybe if I do a bunch of retweets, maybe 20 times. And I'm not president of the United States. That's the first story. Secondly, this day, Friday, included 74 tweets in an hour between 8 and 9 a.m. Eastern time. That is more than a tweet per hour, a tweet per minute for an entire hour. That is an unhealthy level of social media use, which raises further questions on its own. Number 3, again, we're in the middle of a global 100-year pandemic, highest unemployment since 1948, huge nationwide protests, huge police brutality issues, and Donald Trump sets a record for himself tweeting and retweeting 200 times in a single day. That doesn't make sense. We need a leader who can lead and do things. Now, some of you will say, well, Trump can't lead, so we're better off with him just sitting around tweeting. But the tweets are actually doing damage. It's not like the tweets are neutral. He's still doing damage by tweeting. Number 4, Trump just got done attacking Twitter, and he's using it more than ever. Why not get away from Twitter if Twitter is treating him so terribly? Because he simply can't. And that gets us to the clinical aspects of this. I spoke to a couple of mental health professionals over the weekend, and they all had a similar version of the same thing to say, which is essentially that Donald Trump's behavior, as we now see it on Twitter, is compulsive and obsessive. And it's a sort of decompensation of sorts. His behavior is the type of behavior that, you know, if your coworker at Best Buy is behaving this way, if your coworker at an accounting firm is behaving this way, you'd probably go and talk to HR and say, something's not right here. It's manic behavior. It's compulsive behavior. You might have some kind of an intervention. There might be a psychiatric evaluation done at a certain point. That's the type of behavior that we're seeing from Donald Trump. Now, one last thing. You might have noticed that I didn't go through and read individual tweets of Donald Trump during this segment, and there's no shortage of tweets that I could have read. We are past the significance of any one of Donald Trump's tweets in general. Now, if Donald Trump tweets something that's specifically newsworthy or actionable, if it relates to some new policy that his administration is going to be rolling out, if it's a direct attack on an ally, if there's some kind of particular relevance, I will tell you what the content of Trump's tweets is. But what happened on Friday, 200 tweets and retweets, it's just erratic behavior. And I don't want to glorify or lend credence to any one message that Trump sent by actually reading the tweets. You know, it was a combination of lies and smears and attacks and bragging, self-congratulation, retweeting right-wing trash and conspiracy theories. That's what it was. That's the summary. The individual tweets really were irrelevant. They didn't communicate any particular policy. They were mostly smears of other people. So I am not going to give them more credibility or attention than they need, other than to point out 200 tweets in a day is bonkers. And this is the president of the United States. That is where we will leave it. And certainly if Trump does actually tweet something relevant to policy, I will tell you what it is. Fear not. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. I got a voicemail early this morning. I actually don't know what this person is talking about. I think they're mad at me. It's not clear for what. See if you can help me figure it out.
You are so freaking foolish. The only station is Fox News. You have NBC, ABC, the freaking newspaper, and you want to say the only station that is against you is Fox News? You people are so freaking pathetic. I don't even know how you live with yourself.
I really don't know what this person is talking about. I'm trying to think of what I said. I don't know that I've ever said Fox News is the only anything. It's not the only pro-Trump media outlet. It's certainly not a liberal media outlet. It's not, I just have no idea what this person is talking about. If somebody has a better recollection from last week's shows, and you maybe can tell me what it is this person's talking about, please let me know, because I have no clue what it is. Okay, we have a very important bonus show today. Every day we do an additional show. So there's the show that is ending soon, and then there's the next bonus show, which is every single day for our paid subscribers, okay? We are going to talk about qualified immunity for police accused of misconduct. This is a really important apparatus that, were it removed or limited, would make it easier to go after police when they behave badly. The Supreme Court is weighing qualified immunity. We're going to talk about it on today's bonus show. Number two, Fox News put up this crazy graphic, essentially showing how well the stock market sometimes does when there are tragic incidents like black people being killed by police or riots or different things. We are now going to tell you not only what the graph said, but Fox News has apologized. And hey, you know what? Trump never apologizes. At least Fox News is apologizing. That's something we can say. And then lastly, the editor of the New York Times has resigned after backlash over an editorial written by Republican Senator Tom Cotton, and published by the New York Times. Blowback has now led to the editor, James Bennett, resigning. Is this the right thing? We are going to talk about all of those stories and more on today's bonus show. Get instant access by becoming a member at joinpacman.com. And remember to get the daily free podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Pandora, Stitcher, or whatever podcasting program or app you prefer. The Daily Audio Podcast, a very popular way of consuming the show for many of our viewers. I encourage you to check it out. We'll see you on the bonus show.